Okay, topic. I sort of mentioned this concept, Duraphase dynamics, several times. The definition is it's a special format of a long-term self-organization process, observable in some living systems. So the idea was built up by upon ideas of these people, which you all know. I need to mention a difference between them is their perception of the concept of order. And Ross Ashby says the order comes from an algorithm or a principle of repeating calculation. And von Forster said the order comes from a noise, actually a random energy input. And the Prigogine said the order comes from imbalanced, what he called far from equilibrium condition of energy flow. And Harken simply define orders comes from what he called order parameter. So in his synergetic work, synergetics, he make effort to identify those parameters in different systems, from physical systems to human systems as well. And so I have been trying to discuss these issues with some of them. The last one is with the Harken 2 years ago. And gradually I formed, enhanced this idea of expanding the concept of self-organization from the four people mentioned earlier into 3 dimensions. First dimension is what I call the multi-layer self-organization. There's the concept is you have layer after layer for different types of self-organization going on, but one build upon another. So it's a layered structure, like from a very basic dynamics into more and more complexity dynamics. And they had this layered structure. That's from dimension 1. Dimension 2 is that we need to identify the multi-agent self-organizations in different, in the same ecology environment. So they have different processes going on in competing processes. And today I'm going to talk about this third dimension, the third difference, which is what we call Duraphase here. This is pretty early, old example. I noticed that the oscillations in different areas all showed up in a similar pattern. In policy oscillation in a country, you have either more conservative pro-order, and then you have a more radical pro-change. And in the social value, sometimes you have a more equality and security oriented, sometimes you have a more creativity and freedom oriented, and they conflict with each other, but both of them are needed. In animal life, you can observe that they digest food, they rest for comfort, and or they jump up doing hunting, and they show the aggressive actions to gain food. And these are 2 different states that taking turns, each will switching each other. And in economy, you have a spending behavior going on, and you have a producer behavior going on. And in human learning, this is some old language. So, but I said that we organizing information into knowledge, into a coherent whole, or taking in new information. So that was some pretty old idea from a young Jason that was from 1988 and 1989. And after I did that, these two papers, I almost forgot it. But today, in the situation of a very severe bipartisan fight and almost splitting the country into two different ones, and people are threatening to have a coming civil war after November 3rd. So I think it's good for us to revisit this concept, and maybe we can develop it further. It's all coming back to Shannon, von Forster, Ashby, Appleby 1975, and Pask 1979. Basically, they all agreed with the same conceptual frame about this concept of order increasing. So the idea is you have actual measured as a complexity, current complexity of the system, or they use the different terms for the same H. Uncertainty is one, and complexity is another. And Gordon Pask used the information index as the third concept, different word. But they all pointed at in every given system, you have your maximum possible complexity, and you have your current measured complexity. And then you have the ratio, and you do this formula, you got a redundancy as a measure for order. So the conclusion shared by all these pioneers is that only when R is rising in a system, and we can call it self-organizing. Now, the interesting thing is, the last remark I found is from Gordon Pask, and he said either H actual is rising or H max is rising. You can call the system is self-organizing. But here's my idea kicks in. My idea is what happens after R reaches to 1. Because for this formula, your self-organizing process goes from R equals 0, gradually along time, and goes to 1. And well, in their previous cases, typical cases about the self-organization, when redundancy reached to 1, the process stops, or they stop talking about the process. But my suggestion is, in many living systems which have more complex dynamics going on than the simple one-step self-organization, there is actually a different process, which I tentatively call a self-redefining process is going on. So examples like a seed germs, and flower grows blossom, and a bird broke the shell. I mean, the shell is what Jamie called a container. So the eggshell is a container for the life inside it to self-organize itself to the point that the shell needs to be broke. And what exactly is this shell to be broken? I think that what happened is the system is being redefined. So to put it in another way, in that formula, there's that number of variety, and Let's define the Hmax, and those two value is defined by the observer when they draw the boundary and name the variable of the system. So when that definition is being changed, when that intention of the observer, thinker, actor is being changed, and when the boundary are being redrawn and variables are being renamed, that N and the Hmax does not exist for the formula of redundancy. So at that time period, there is no self-organizing process during that breaking time. But we do observe longer processes in nature, longer than a one-step R racing from 0 to 1. So my observation is that in many cases, when R reaches to 1, the living system starts a different process, a container breaking process. It may be due to the biological gene, but in psychological and the social and human societies, it may due to cultural gene. So that's my wide guess. So that is what I said, Duraphase dynamic. You have a phase P or phase progressive order increasing versus phase Q, quick boundary redefining. So this is two different phases. So I try to put it in an image as if your time goes like from here to here, and the system are experiencing two types of self-organization. One type is that R redundancy from 0 goes to 1. And then suddenly, boom, you've got a break. And during this break, there is no Hmax. So there is no definition of R. So you just get a chaos period. And then you redefine your boundary, and you started another process of growth to the 1, and then break again. And this taking turns back and forth, back and forth. One example, very obvious from kindergarten, is the life cycle of a butterfly. So here as an egg, the butterfly experienced self-organizing processes within the egg. And then to the point the egg broke, so it jumps into a different form, like a caterpillar crawling and eating. And then also the life become mature in this process, and it changes into a pupa, another form of the life, and then another form of the life. So from a butterfly's life cycle, you will see there's 4 different stages. But for our human, we do not have this in biological forms, but we have this kind of process going on in our psychological forms, in our mind, that we do our paradigm shift at a certain age, and we shift our value system, and and also I used the example of a knowledge system. So to summarize, eigenmechanism is my word for that period from R from 0 to 1 process. Only explains the self-organizing processes when R increase from 0 to 1, maximum order and existing definition of the system. Many living systems, for example, life, ecology system, knowledge system, has multiple steps of self-organization. Probably because of a biological gene decided, or because of a cultural gene decided that they will have that kind of a switch. The system may break its shares at a point when the previous stage of self-organization is almost accomplished or almost finished, and then they jump of re-specifying a new system boundary opens a new level of self-organizing processes. Another example is the moving I just accomplished. I relocated from Washington, D.C., Washington back to Arizona. We have to reorganize the whole house. So during the jump or during the share breaking phase, there's no definition of Hmax because N was not defined. So there's no definition of R neither. And this is earlier slides. I pick up a few examples. In physics ideas, you have Aristotle idea, then you got Galileo and Newton, and you have Einstein, and each towards the previous one is the share breaking. And in management science, you have Taylor, Ferrier, Ford, and you have McGregor, Carnage, Simon, Arcueil, Deming, Sage. Also, on each level, it's a share breaking broke from the earlier system. So that's the idea. Each stage of phase P has a different boundary of the knowledge system. Within each stage or each paradigm, there are a large number of self-organizing refinement activities for the existing data and the knowledge structures. So coming back to the summary, it's very simple. It's like a person's walking. What exactly is walking are two processes. One process is you tend to fall down, and another process is you turn to re-stabilize, but on one step further. So this phenomena of things taking turns, switching back and forth like a pendulum is the idea of Duraphase mechanism. So that's it.
Jason?
Yes.
It's not unclear to me as you move from layer to layer if you're using the same dictionary of terms or you're using different dictionaries of terms, propositional terms, logical terms.
From layer to layer, you mean this one?
I don't have the zoom up. I'm on telephone.
Oh,
so
okay.
So you gave 5 layers or 6, and you see discrete changes of forms of dynamics as you move from layer to layer. And my question is a semantic one. The semantic one is, are you using the same dictionary to describe the motion from layer to layer?
Yeah, I think I do, because the central term is that measurement of order. And the measurement of order previously defined as redundancy increasing. So that formula depends on the Hmax and the actual, the entropy measurement. So my point is, in any perceived system, that Hmax is actually given by the observer. So there is a limitation of that formula to the ceiling of that formula is that your redundancy increased to 1. Then what happened? Then they stopped discussing. They say, okay, that's done. The system, the self-organization is accomplished. But
okay, so
my intention.
If I understand you correctly,
yeah.
if I understand you correctly, then in a social system or in the political system, the anger is an expression of entropy, as it would be in a purely informational computer system.
What I was trying to extend the previous pioneers' conceptual system is that in our observation of the real world, we see so many living systems live much longer than just one cycle of the self-organization. So it's a problem of, it's a challenge to distinguish self-organization versus growth. And for a life cycle like a butterfly, and you have 4 different phases of self-organization, and they happen one after another. That's a simple life for a butterfly. But for our human mind and our knowledge system and the science and all the political value system, you see a much longer time span than just a one-step self-organizing. So what I was saying is Ashby, von Forst, the Prigogine, and Harken, their version of self-organization only cover a short period of the system being observed. And we need a longer lens. I mean, we need a wider angle lens to see the whole picture.
Yeah, I agree.
What I hear Jerry saying is that understanding the measure of order is from an observer's standpoint. If the observer doesn't change their symbolic language as they go through the differing orders of organization, you are doing violence to the system. And by doing violence to the system, I mean your existing logic as an observer is insufficient to deal with the complexity of changing orders of organization.
Or if you say in limited, and we need to break that limit.
Right. Jerry, you want to elaborate on that?
Well, I think the question is communication as you move from layer to layer. If you decide to use one set of terms for physical interactions, such as entropy, then if you use that same dictionary, the physicist dictionary, and apply it to a social system, you have deep tensions between the meaning of the terms, so that when you move from layer to layer, perhaps you need to make a new dictionary for each layer. Not that these dictionaries are totally independent of one another, just that they are related to one another.
So do you think that we can use a long-term valid vocabulary other than entropy?
Oh, yes.
For example, can you give us an example?
Oh, for example, deduction works in all of these. Induction works in all of them. Logical terms in general should work across many of these. An exception here might be, for example, the logical term of abduction from Peirce. Perhaps it doesn't work, is not very useful in physics at all. but it's quite useful in higher orders of self-organization, where the choice is not deterministic.
So
where in organizational decision making, the abductive processes are to first list the possible potential forms of organization and then seek purposely one of those goals.
So you mean we don't need to continue using concept like entropy or the redundancy and even order?
Yeah,
If
you wish to look at it that way, the question is, what will be the variables in your language? In the language
I think Hans von Forst himself once said, maybe jokingly or maybe not jokingly, he said that there's no such thing of called self-organizing system. So he said, and after he argued about why there's no such thing called self-organizing, and he turns back saying, okay, I was still using the concept of self-organizing system. And I found it still very useful to observe our daily life, and even, for example, the current political fight going on between the two ranks. Each not very good, but each section, each side of the political opponents will consider a disaster or an end of the world if the other side is get elected. So the tension is currently building on in this country that it looks like, my question is, are we organizing into two different countries? Or are we still, can we still keep our peace and order as the same United States?
Gregory Bateson, when he was over there looking at the Naven, he couldn't figure out how a culture that was so divided between male and female. I mean, the men literally went around with tubes 6 feet long to look at their phallus, and totally denigrated the females. He says, how can that system, which fed upon itself over a year, stay as a system? Why didn't it fall apart? And it was only just like residents in medicine, why they have to stay there more than a couple hours to watch a patient, because time creates the resolution. And then he saw the ritual called the Naven, where the women became the men and the men became the women. That ability to say the schism of the society then was reordered in a ritual where the women went around with the phallus denigrating the men. and so that ability to say, so it's not a dual system, it's a tripartite system. A dual system of oppositions, order. And so I really like what you did in terms of the measure of order. I think that's brilliant, Jason, how you put that together. But then there's another level of the boundaries that keep the system of systems together. So you have a system of oppositions like in a democracy or a legal trial system, but you have to have something above that that provides the resolution so it doesn't get into a positive feedback loop. And that's where the second generation of Americans became Emerson, Thoreau, creating this transcendence. Americans, when they founders talked about it as just as nature or the God of nature, they went into a little farther, but the idea that you resolve it at a higher level, and this self-organization happens at 2 levels.
One difference of my suggestion than what you just said. What you just said is that we need a synthesis. I mean, thesis, antithesis, and synthesis, and the bigger container to contain the both. But my observation is sometimes we don't have that luxury. I mean, that a bigger container might be a luxury, especially on a societal level. So the solution may be simple. Solution may be that why not your different value system holders take turns to be in charge. And that coincident with the two-party system. You see, the Republicans dominate 8 years and the Democrats come over, dominate another 8 years and create another set of problem, and the Republicans come back and do another 8 years. And if we could actively, I mean, intentionally doing this shifting, taking turns, then that might be a format of what your bigger contender is. Maybe the solution is very simple. It's let's take turns. Jamie.
Yes, I see here, especially when we look at the slide that's in front of us, this where you clearly acknowledges there are different stages, Jason. I think that is a fascinating visual, and your whole presentation is fascinating. However, instead of going to your solution, I would strongly encourage that you go to the object relations literature in psychoanalysis, because there you can find a narrative that you can superimpose on your presentation, and it gives a very, very different outcome. And actually, since I don't want to put the burden on you guys, I'm in the process of writing a little summary to share it with you. This is about what that object relations stuff really is about. For instance, the two sides, the us versus the them, and that is really a projection. We're the good ones and they're the evil. That's the simple way of thinking, and that's a primitive way of thinking that is being hypothesized in object relations, that is of a baby. Maybe the first 6 months it does good and bad, and that's it. And then it realizes that actually they call that the good and the evil breast. So once it looks at the breast as a good thing, nourishing, warmed, welcoming, and then the other time it looks at the breast as suffocating, nearly killing the baby. This the breast becomes the enemy. And that's from Melanie Klein, by the way. No, so the baby is then confronted with the good and the evil breast. And then one day, and that is when the baby goes to the next stage, stage 2, it realizes the good and the evil breast belong to the same body. And so it needs to rearrange its thinking. However, that implies that there is some sort of a welcoming environment that the baby can let go of the idea of the evil breast. And according to this narrative, we are in a society where a lot of people are still stuck in this primitive way of thinking of the good and the evil breast. And if you look around you, you will see there is a group of people that's like the third group that you don't talk about, who think this is nonsense, who think there is something wrong with the way we're thinking, that it's always in us first.
Where is this source? I'm highly interested. This is the first time I've heard that good and the bad breast.
I will.
It's in Playboy.
I mean, it's somebody's favorite. I mean, it's in imagination. I mean, how did they actually measure the baby's perception?
Well, Jason, I will send you references and then you can ask questions and I will send you more and more references. The woman who came up with this idea, her name was Melanie Klein, and it was in the 1930s, and she was from Germany. Actually, I believe she may have been Austrian. She lived in Germany and then she came to England. And she was a psychoanalyst, and she really wanted to be welcomed by the psychoanalyst community. And she was in some way stubborn, but in another way, she really wanted to be not excluded. So what I'm trying to say, she did come up with this expression. Now, at some point, people thought the good and the evil, that we need to sanitize the language because
what would your guru Karl Popper comment on this? I mean,
well, I think
science
that
or pseudoscience?
yeah, I think that Karl Popper actually was pursuing something similar in his thinking, but he worked with psychoanalysts, so he had a PhD in psychology, but he kind of let that go and he said, I'm more interested in physics. But when you read this text, you see him at some point saying that he kind of agrees with psychoanalysis. And that is something that has not been further pursued. So I think he might be in agreement. But in order to qualify that, there are two very different branches. Actually, there may be 10 different branches in psychoanalysis. And the one that I'm mentioning here is an explicit rejection. Object relations is an explicit rejection of Freud's machine. Freud set up people as a hydraulic machine. And then some guy in England said, no, I don't think we need a machine. We can just think of people as containers and relations between containers. And so according to this view, we have a system of containers in our mind, and then we're saturated and it doesn't get us anywhere. So we need to rearrange the system. So now we go to the next level, and then we're again stuck, and now we go to the next level. And your slide is really, I think, about human development, about how to become a participating adult, and how some people just never went to the next stage. And so that we actually have dus according to your slide, dus we have people that are still in the first stage, people in the second stage, and then people in the third stage. And that is our challenge, is to bring everyone up to that third stage of development. So using your butterfly example, the people that are still in the, what is it, the egg stage, have the mentality of an egg, and then, or whatever, and then other people, they're still in the larva stage. And then there are the butterflies that are telling, hey, life is wonderful as a butterfly. But then those people, they never get
percentage of how many people can reach to the flying stage.
Well, everyone has that potential, kind of, but it depends on their environment, whether they're given the opportunity. What allows for the transition is you have to deal with paradoxes, and that you say, I want to solve the paradox. And other people may say, oh no, there is no paradox, you're the evil one. They are all the reason my life doesn't work. My thinking is perfect, there is no paradox, it's all the bad people. And is a willingness to say, no, that doesn't make sense, because my best friend has become a bad person according to my own way of thinking, because he has from a different political opinion than me. So how is this possible that one day he's my best friend and the next day he becomes an idiot? And so working through that sort of thinking.
So the challenge for us is, how do we break out of the container of second order isolationism?
Stuart?
Stuart,
Stuart, that's a second order question for you.
how do we break out of our second order container?
You're still muted. You're still muted, Stuart.
Sorry. Yes, it's been a good discussion. I could say more about the different interpretations of self-organizing systems, but the measure of redundancy, you just pick a measure and you just count the number of your total elements that fall within that definition. For example, in my dissertation, I looked at the self-organization of the telegraph industry in the United States. And what you see is that you started off with a large number of telegraph companies, and more of them grew up along the way. And then they began to merge. And it made a very nice graph as a sort of tree diagram of all the various companies and how they were connected with one another. At the end, you had one company, Western Union, because it was a natural monopoly. Now, that makes sense and it works because you just have one issue that you're dealing with, which is how many previously independent companies are now a part of one company. But so many things to deal with self-organization are very multidimensional. You get into life and things like that. If you try to do the same thing with species, for example, you have great variety in species. I mean, you could do it, but you'd have to start off with an appropriate set of definitions so that when you count something, you're counting something that makes sense. So self-organization is a great concept, but the basic issue underlying it was, how do you get increasing order in the presence of the second law of thermodynamics? I mean, physics and thermodynamics say everything's becoming disordered, but we look around and the things are getting more ordered in terms of species and so forth. So how do you explain that? And many people addressed it, as Jijuan pointed out.
Could I comment, Stuart?
Sure.
Sure. Yeah, I agree that the issue of self-organization is multifaceted, and language is often vague, and the various dictionaries of description from various disciplines can be used to attempt to describe self-organization. But I disagree with regard to the role of thermodynamics in self-organization. The second law is the second law because it is secondary to the first law. And that in order to self-organize, work must be done. So the first law of thermodynamics, that is the relationship of work and energy, is what is accomplished in self-organization. Now, in the 1940s, the Italian physicist used the term syntropy. And he developed this mathematically from the principles, basic principles, by basically just changing the sign of variables. So that if you start with the concept that thermodynamics is not about work, that is, it is about the flow, just a simple flow of heat that is determining self-organization, you end up in the conundrum that you just stated. On the other hand, if you look at thermodynamics as a relationship of work, like you get out of a steam engine, then you end up with a constructive approach to self-organization.
Oh, we have our Russian friend, Slava, coming. Welcome.
Hello, everybody.
I consider myself spiritually a theoretical biologist. so self-organization basically means that you're changing the internal constraints of the system, its internal organization, in a manner that increases its apparent complexity to an external observer. So, and I think, you know, morphogenesis is one way of looking at it if you don't take into account the genetic constraints. And this business of different phases of development are basically you're seeing the different sets of constraints come into play as the organism develops. I think self-organization in the Piagetian sense, in the learning context, is much different. And there, what it means is that you have internal organization that's not being specified by some sort of external teacher or an external force that's imposing it on the organization, on the internal system, but it's spontaneously arising through that system's interactions with its environment. I've never thought that the thermodynamic, I mean, thermodynamics is another window on things, but it's not all that useful in terms of how you recognize when the system is changing its internal structure. And so my doctoral work way back when in the 80s was how do you have an operational definition of functional emergence, and that builds on Rosen's notion of emergence relative to a model. And when an observer is observing a system and initially can track that system in terms of predicting its behavior, and then the system evolves in a certain way, in some way in which the system has acquired new internal constraints and or interactions with its environment, such as evolving a sensor or a new concept, then the observer has to change their model and observables through which they see that system in order to regain predictability. So that's an operational definition of how you recognize novelty and how you infer that the internal organization of a system has changed. We can be clear about all these things if we want to be. We should not wallow in ambiguity. You know, I'm of that feeling that it's possible to have clear definitions of self-organizing systems and novelty and emergence, but only if you include the observer explicitly in that characterization.
Well, Peter, I noticed also you wrote something in the chat box. Maybe we can exchange. I will send you I send everybody the PPT, and maybe you can put something in writing that what you just mentioned. You muted. You muted.
Most of it's in writing in the chat box.
I mean more than chat box, but we have our new friend Slava coming, and we need to welcome him. And please say something about yourself, Slava.
My first education is theoretical physics, and then I dealt with systems methodologies, initially in methodology of science, and then in methodology of some practical areas, for example, public administration, regional development, etc. And now I am in contact with ISSS with some colleagues in Great Britain and in World Organization of System and Cybernetics. Stuart Ampleby is my old friend. Can I see this, Stuart?
Yeah, sure.
Yes, and I am very glad to join your circle.
Yes, and I think I know Slava from the Karl Popper circle. Is that right?
Yes, yes.
Karl, yeah. And you sent an email like a couple of days ago about some conference at the financial university in December, I think. And I shared it with the Club of Remy, and also
that's how he got here.
Yes, really, and you are welcome to this conference. Stuart know about it, and he participated in discussions in financial university, but online. But we hope that sometimes you can go to Moscow, of course.
yes, and also a paper about the three world hypothesis of Karl Popper you shared.
Yes, the Club of Remy, tell you a secret. Club of Remy is actually Club of Ampleby. So everybody Ampleby knows should be invited. So what do you say, Stuart?
Well, maybe in the beginning it was my contacts, but Juan has expanded it.
One of the issues that we just brought up was about Rosen. I've been in contact with Judith Rosen, the daughter, and she's down in Texas helping her daughter or her sister going through some surgery, but she would like to possibly participate.